go through basic training. I was put into infantry replacement training down in Fort McClellan, Alabama, Anniston, Alabama, with about 15,000 other young kids, GIs, going through all that. And I have to tell you that basic training, I guess I hate to admit it, but I enjoyed it. We, you know, firing rifles and throwing stuff, hand grenades, and doing all this sort of stuff, and camping out like old major Boy Scout camp to some extent. But the one thing I didn't like, because I knew we were learning to kill and be killed, I didn't like the bayonet practice we had to go through. Maybe some of you all did that, where you had to put your bayonet on the rifle and jam away. Anyway, about the 8th or 9th or 10th of December of '44 is when the Battle of Bulge started. Who here was in the Battle of Bulge? Somebody?
Tracker.
Yeah, okay. Was it the 9th or 10th of December that year? And now Litt Anderson, who's not here, I think he was captured the very first day that the Germans came through. And if you've probably heard his story, he was impounded in a fenced-in enclosure, but snuck out after about 24 hours and got back, so he escaped. But because of that, they shortened our training from 16 weeks to 12. We were originally supposed to ship over to Europe on about the 2nd or 3rd of February. They cut it short. We're now supposed to go out on the 2nd or 3rd of January. Now, the last week in December of 44, I was in our final bivouac. We were out in the mountains. They call them mountains there. Out in Utah where I live now, and they think of them as hills. But anyway, they had a lot of snow, and I had shared my shelter half with 3 other guys. We'd made ourselves a tent and all that sort of stuff. And I remember particularly we had 2 little candles. In spite of all the snow outside, those candles kept us warm in the tent. Well, in the morning of the 30th of December, 4 o'clock, the sergeant came around and said, "Gates, you in there?" I said, "Yes, sir." We spoke very respectfully to sergeants. He said, "Get your stuff together. You got to go back in." "Sarge, what's the matter?" Now, my grandfather was living with us. I mentioned my dad had died. My grandfather was ill. I thought, oh my gosh, this is emergency furlough. He said, "I don't know, just do as you're told. Get your stuff together, go to the mess tent, get some coffee, you got to hike back in." Well, hiking back in, not only was it 18 miles with about 90 pounds of pack on your back, but it was snowing like crazy. I said, "Sergeant, haven't you got a ride for us?" "Nope, do as you're told." So I went over to get some coffee. There were 4 other guys. And there were like 15,000 soldiers in training down there. So anyway, here are 4 others, but they had no thought about an emergency furlough like I did, so it kind of escaped my mind. But we hiked back in. Immediately when we got back in, we were issued brand new uniforms. I was in a separate barracks than they were. I was by myself in a brand new uniform. And all that day and the next day, which happened to be the 31st, I was writing letters and stuff like that. But in the afternoon, I said, "Sarge, I think the lieutenant would give me a pass to go into the USO tonight. It's New Year's Eve." Well, he did, and I had a good time. Maybe some of you all did too. Anyway, I got back at about 6 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day and went to bed. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all my buddies came back in. All that snow had melted. They were a muddy mess, and I was sitting on the edge of my bunk in a brand new uniform. You know about the Band of Brothers. I'm sure you all experienced some of that. Let's get very close to these guys. We had been in training to kill and be killed together. And I knew I wasn't going overseas, and they were. And I was very glad that about 5 o'clock that afternoon, after they'd come in, I got my orders to get out. But I just wanted to mention one guy. Maybe most of you don't remember Bill Boyd. You ever hear of Bill Boyd? He died after about 20 minutes after he got in combat in France. He was from Nashville. He was all-state basketball player from West High when I was there. And he was our guide on. He was 6'6". He carried the colors. Anyway, he was killed in 20 minutes after he got into the war. I was put on a train with these other guys, and we went up to New York. Met at Penn Station by an officer in a van. "Where are we going?" "You know, you'll find out." He took us up to the New York University of Engineering School, which is up in the Bronx. It's now the Bronx Community College. Now you got to remember, I knew nothing about anything. Not many other people did at all. This is mysterious. What's this happening? Well, I was billeted in Gould Hall up there, which is still there. It's now the Bronx Community College. But in my particular suite, 2 rooms with 3 double bunks in it. So there were 6 of them in this room, and I began to find out who these guys were. Actually, my roommate in my double bunk was good friend who just recently died named Harvey Willard. He was a young physicist from MIT. Ken Reed across in the other double bunk was a mechanical engineer from Penn State, all of us undergraduates. Dick Reed, another one over here, was a chemistry major at Harvard. These were kids, all of us were undergraduates. We all had some form of technical training, but we were studying chemical engineering. None of us had had any chemical engineering. That's mysterious in itself, but this was about, we were going to go out and be the grunts for helping the physicists do whatever they needed to do, okay? And we needed to know something about everything that was going on, so we enjoyed electrical engineering. During the spring when Germany surrendered, but also we were interviewed by a couple of old guys, civilian, probably 35 years old. And what in the world are they doing not in uniform? Interviewing us. Here, we were in uniform, we were privates, but anyway. When we went into New York, whenever we had a chance, we could have just as well been returning veterans coming over on furlough or something, and we took advantage of this. One interesting time, Dick Reed, who is this tall, stately Irish kid from Boston, and Harvey Willard, Harvey and I got on one side of Dick. He put on dark glasses, and I'll have to say, VE Day, we marched down Times Square with him holding onto our arms as if he was blind. It was an awful thing to do, but at the time we thought it was fun. And I remember that VE Day that a whole troop of Free French sailors went marching down Times Square singing the Marseillaise. And then that night, Dick Reed and I took the Staten Island ferry over to Staten Island and back because it went right by the Statue of Liberty, which was lighted for the first time that night. And I tell you right now, the emotion is still there, the hairs on the back of my neck. We had to be back in our barracks up at Gould Hall at midnight. We got up there, and Harvey had a little radio, and all the radio stations signed off at midnight. And so as they signed off, they rang the cracked Liberty Bell from Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Excuse me, that's very emotional to me this day. Shortly after that, we were interviewed by these two civilians, and we were broken up into two groups. There probably were 40 of us there. Half of us about that went up to Presque Isle, Maine, and they became attached to the Air Corps. Some of them became chief engineers on the B-29, which is pretty much new and secret at the time. The rest of us, which included me, were put on the train. All of a sudden, we were in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this is great. Maybe there must be a base around here somewhere. I'll be close to home. Well, we put on a bus and we took across the countryside, and it was countryside back then until we came to a sign that said Oak Ridge. Now, I'd grown up in Nashville. I'd never heard of Oak Ridge. It was apparently pretty much of a crossroad back at the time. But when we went in there, it was a beehive of activity. Something was going on. Well, I was only there one night, but I was crossing a bridge to go over to the mess hall to get some chow. Coming the other way was a friend of mine who'd graduated a year ahead of me at Vanderbilt in chemical engineering, Hugh Richardson. I don't know if that name means anything to you. He lived here for quite a while. And Hugh was in uniform. And I said, Hugh, what in the world are you doing in this gosh awful place? And he looked at me and said, I'll be dogged if I know. I know what I do, but I don't know what I'm doing. That's important because that's what Groves had done. He'd compartmentalized everything. Nobody really knew unless you were up pretty high up as what was going on. I was in grad school with him afterwards. He happened to have been working on the gaseous diffusion plant. And he did not know what it was for, but he did know that it was concentrating uranium-235. Now, let me just explain. That's why we're so worried about Iran and all these centrifuges. Uranium-235 is a part of the uranium atom. There's uranium-238 and 235. 238 is no good. It won't fission. 235 will. But there's a difference in weight between 235 and 238. So that difference in weight is helpful if you're centrifuging. But worse than that, there's 150 parts of uranium-238 to 1 part of 235. So it's a real double whammy. That's why it takes forever and ever and ever to centrifuge to get a concentration of uranium-235. Oak Ridge on a train sealed up in a Pullman car, about 25 of us, and I mean sealed up. We left Knoxville and the train went up to, I think, Louisville. It switched off to another train that was switched that went over to St. Louis. It was switched off to probably what was the original Santa Fe Chief back then, and we took off west. Now, we thought we were going to the Pacific. All this. And the train went on, and it finally stopped in the middle of the desert outside of Santa Fe and detached our car and left us there. But something I didn't know at the time was that one guy on our group, Corporal Hall was his name, the rest of us were privates. Every time the train made an appropriate stop, he would make a phone call, and he'd say, "This is Corporal Hall reporting. Our shipment is intact, and no one has approached us." And this very well get back on the train. This is their way of knowing that nobody was suspicious of what we were doing. We certainly didn't know what we were doing. After about an hour, here came a bus across the prairie there, picked us up, took us off. "Where are we going? Where are we going?" "Shh, you'll find out." That's what the driver told us. I heard that at least a dozen times in the next hour. We went along, and all of a sudden we came to a sign that said Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'd heard of Santa Fe. I'd never been there. Must be a military base around here somewhere. Well, if you know the geography there, we went right through Santa Fe and up the Rio Grande River to Espanola, New Mexico. There was a bridge there that was heavy enough that we could cross over. We went over that, came down the other side to a gravel road, and turned off and went up into the mountains to that little, that's the road up to Los Alamos. Los Alamos is up over the rise there, and this happens to be the gate at Los Alamos. Back then it was called the Los Alamos Ranch for Boys. It became Los Alamos Project Gate. And this is what a couple of scenes in there was. Well, when I got up that first gate, the guy checked us through and sent us over, went over a rise, and then we came to this sign, Los Alamos Ranch for Boys. I went in there and didn't get out till the war was over. Not for anything, or any news. All our letters were mailed open, and every mail that came in was scrutinized to see if anybody knew something. Our mail was all sent to a post office box somewhere else. I still had no idea that, I remember that night, we got in kind of late, and I think I played softball that night. It was wonderful. The next morning at 8 o'clock, I reported into this room where this guy who was in front of a big blackboard drew this great big circle. Let's see, well, yeah, a little further on I'll have to get, yeah, there, see, drew a big circle like that on the right. And he said, "This is why you're here. We're building a new type of bomb." Now you got to remember, we were dropping 2-ton blockbusters, and boy, they could destroy a lot, particularly if you took time in many of them. He said, "We're building a new bomb that's equivalent of more than 10,000 tons of TNT. I think in today's vernacular, the young kids would say, "Yeah, right." Well, but I was a private, and okay. I got assigned to work at S site, which was out a ways on a different mesa, where we made these castings. These are called lenses right there. Now, when you detonate the bomb, there's a detonation point right up there. There's 30 of them around the sphere altogether. But if you detonate right there, it's circular, like throwing a pebble in the water. The shock wave is like this. Well, you got to have the shock wave turned around to this. There's where this grapefruit of plutonium goes, right in there. And this is about the actual size. It wasn't solid, it was a disc, but that's it. Now, the composition of this is pure TNT there, or composition B, and this was the same. But in these lenses, I was a young guy working with a bunch of guys that were called powder men. They had been used to handling TNT, filling shells. I think they were from the Holston Ordnance Works up in East Tennessee. And they filled bombs and shells, and they weren't afraid of it. But what we did was take TNT and put it in a big sugar kettle and melt it. Now, it melted well below the boiling point of water, so we had no trouble keeping it cool enough. I think it maybe melted around 170 Fahrenheit or something like that. And we cast it into molds. We made these shape charges. And the lenses were the thing that I particularly worked on. It was kind of interesting.